The sun rose slowly over Seattle's Queen Anne Hill, painting the glass walls of a massive modern mansion in soft gold. From the outside, the house looked like something out of a luxury magazine. Clean lines, wide windows, and a view of the Puget Sound that only the ultra-wealthy could afford. But inside, it felt nothing like a dream home. It felt like a battlefield. Margaret Hale stood barefoot on the cold marble floor of her living room, staring at her phone. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes were tired. The message on her screen was short, polite, and painfully familiar. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hale. I can't continue working in your home. Please send my payment." Another nanny had quit, the sixth one this month. Margaret closed her eyes and let out a slow, frustrated breath. As the CEO of one of the most powerful tech companies in the country, she negotiated billion-dollar deals without blinking. She could dominate boardrooms filled with ruthless men in tailored suits, but somehow she couldn't keep a single caretaker for her own children. From the hallway came the sound of crashing, shouting, and a loud bang. "Emily, Sophie, I told you not to," Margaret began, already knowing it was too late. A bright blue toy truck slid across the marble floor and slammed into the wall near her feet. Moments later, two of her daughters came running, laughing wildly, while the others followed behind, arguing, teasing, and pushing. 5 girls, 5 hurricanes. Emily, the oldest at 14, wore a defiant smirk that hit a wounded heart. Sophie, 12, was sharp-tongued and sarcastic. Lily, 10, watched everything with guarded eyes. Ava, 8, was restless and dramatic. And little Grace, only 6, was small but stubborn, clinging to chaos like a shield. They had all been sweet once, before their father died, before grief hollowed out the house. Margaret straightened her posture, forcing her voice to sound firm. "Girls, this is not acceptable behavior. We need to talk." Emily rolled her eyes. "What's the point? She's gone already, right? Another nanny who couldn't handle us." Margaret felt something twist in her chest. Emily was right. They always left. And the girls knew it. Margaret didn't answer. She simply turned away and walked back toward the tall windows overlooking the city, pretending to read emails while her heart quietly cracked. She had tried everything: discipline, therapy, expensive private schools, and the best caregivers money could buy. But nothing seemed to fill the empty space their father had left behind, and no one stayed long enough to truly reach them. A soft knock echoed through the front hall. Margaret looked up. The security system had already approved the visitor. It was the cleaning service. A moment later, the door opened, and a man stepped inside, pushing a janitor's cart. He was in his late 30s, wearing a simple gray uniform, his hair slightly messy from the morning wind. His face was calm, steady, not rushed, not nervous. There was something grounded about him. "Good morning," he said politely. "I'm Ethan. I'm here for the cleaning." Margaret barely nodded. "Go ahead, just do your best." The girls watched him from the staircase like curious predators. A stranger, a new target. Grace whispered loudly, "Let's make him quit too." Ethan didn't hear her. Or maybe he did, but he didn't react. He quietly wheeled his cart inside and began wiping down the kitchen counter as if the house were completely peaceful. Ava immediately ran past him, knocking over a stack of magazines. Lily flicked the light switch on and off. Sophie dropped her juice on the floor. Chaos exploded around him. But Ethan didn't raise his voice. He didn't sigh, he didn't scold. He simply stepped around the mess, picked up a cloth, and calmly wiped the juice away. That alone was strange. Margaret watched from the hallway, confused. Most workers got irritated within minutes. This man moved like nothing bothered him. The girls, unsettled by his lack of reaction, tried harder. Emily walked up to him and said coldly, "You won't last." "They never do." Ethan looked at her gently. "Maybe," he replied, "but I'm here right now." Something in his tone made Emily pause. For a split second, the mansion was quiet. Margaret felt a strange pull in her chest, like hope trying to wake up after a long sleep. And for the first time in a long while, the house felt like something was about to change. Ethan kept working as if nothing unusual were happening around him. The marble floors still reflected the chaos of the morning: spilled juice, scattered toys, crooked picture frames. But his movements were steady, deliberate, and unhurried, the kind of calm that didn't need to announce itself. The 5 girls hovered near him like a storm waiting to break. Grace crawled under the dining table and rolled a toy toward his feet. Ava turned the TV volume all the way up. Lily bumped into his cleaning cart on purpose. Sophie whispered something sharp and sarcastic. Emily simply stood there, arms crossed, studying him like a suspicious detective. Most adults would have snapped by now. Ethan didn't. He bent down, picked up the toy, and gently placed it back on the table. Then he turned the TV volume down with a quiet click. No lecture, no irritation, just calm. Emily narrowed her eyes. "You're weird." Ethan smiled faintly. "I get that a lot." Margaret watched from the hallway, pretending to check her phone while actually paying attention to every movement. The house usually felt tense, brittle, and emotionally charged, like something could shatter at any moment. But right now, the air felt softer. Ethan reached the kitchen and pulled out a small sandwich from his lunch bag. He sat down on the floor, leaning against the cabinet, and began to eat slowly. The girls froze. Adults didn't sit on the floor in this house. "What are you doing?" Ava asked. "Eating lunch," Ethan replied. "Want to join?" Sophie scoffed. "We don't eat down there." "Well," he said gently, brushing crumbs off his sleeve, "sometimes the floor is the best place to see things clearly." That made Lily blink. One by one, the girls drifted closer, drawn by curiosity they couldn't explain. They didn't sit, but they didn't leave either. Grace spoke first. "Do you have kids?" Ethan nodded. "A daughter. She's 8. Ava's eyes softened. "What's her name?" "Maya." "But can't we? What's she like?" Ethan smiled, this time wider. "Stubborn, funny, sensitive, brave when she doesn't realize she's being brave." Those words hung in the air. Emily swallowed. "Our dad used to call us brave." Margaret's breath caught. No one had said his name in weeks. Ethan didn't push. He just nodded, letting the silence do its work. Lily sat down beside him. Then Grace. Then Ava. Sophie hesitated but eventually joined. Even Emily slowly lowered herself to the floor, careful not to look like she cared. The mansion felt smaller, warmer. They began to talk. First about school, then about teachers, then about how people always expected them to behave just because they were rich. "Everyone thinks we're spoiled," Sophie muttered. "Yeah," Emily added quietly. "No one thinks we're lonely." Ethan listened with attentive, patient eyes, never interrupting. He had spent years listening to a little girl explain the world from a child's point of view. This wasn't new to him. "When someone listens," he said softly, "it's easier to breathe." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes. Ava knocked over her cup by accident. Juice spread across the floor. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, bracing for yelling. Ethan handed her a towel. "Want to help me clean it up?" She blinked. "You're not mad." "Why would I be?" he replied. "Accidents happen." That simple kindness felt like sunlight in winter. As they wiped the floor together, laughter slipped out. Real laughter. Margaret watched, heart pounding. For the first time since her husband died, her home didn't feel like it was breaking. It felt like it was breathing again. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of the Hale mansion, casting long golden shadows across the living room floor. For once, the house wasn't loud. It wasn't tense. It felt strangely peaceful. Ethan wiped his hands on a cloth and glanced around at the 5 girls sitting near him. Their faces, once guarded and sharp, now looked softer. Still cautious, but no longer hostile. "All right," he said lightly. "Who wants to help me finish cleaning this place before the sun disappears?" Sophie raised an eyebrow. "Why would we do that?" "Because," Ethan replied with a small grin, "if we work together, it'll go faster. And I'll race you." Ava gasped. "A race?" "Yep, living room versus kitchen. Winner gets bragging rights." Emily scoffed. "You're not going to beat us." "That's what Maya says every time," he said. "And she's usually wrong." That earned a few reluctant smiles. Within minutes, the mansion was filled with motion. Not chaos, but purpose. Lily wiped down shelves with quiet focus. Ava picked up toys with dramatic flair. Grace zipped across the floor with a dust cloth. Even Sophie, usually aloof, joined in, folding blankets with surprising care. Emily watched them for a moment, then slowly grabbed a trash bag and began helping too. Margaret stood by the doorway, stunned. Her daughters had never cleaned voluntarily. Ethan moved among them, offering gentle encouragement and appreciative smiles. "Nice job, Lily." "Thanks, Ava." "That helps, Grace." Every word of gratitude seemed to land deeply. "You say thank you a lot," Sophie said. "People don't hear it enough," Ethan replied. The girls felt quiet. After a while, they collapsed onto the couch, breathing hard, laughing like they hadn't in years. Grace leaned against Ethan's arm. "You're not scary." He smiled. "Good. Are you going to leave?" Lily asked suddenly. The room froze. Ethan met her eyes. I'm here today. That's what matters. Emily swallowed. They always say that. I won't make promises I can't keep, he said gently. But I don't quit just because things get loud. Something in his voice felt real, solid, dependable. Margaret felt her chest tighten. She stepped forward. How are you doing this? She asked quietly. Ethan looked at her. Your girls don't need to be fixed. They need to be heard. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. In that moment, she realized she had been trying to manage their pain instead of facing it. Outside, Seattle's sky turned pink and gray as evening approached. Inside, 5 wounded hearts felt just a little lighter. And for the first time, the Hale mansion felt like it was becoming a home. The sky outside the Hale mansion had turned a soft shade of blue-gray, the kind that always came before rain in Seattle. Inside, the living room felt warm, filled with the quiet hum of something new. Comfort. The 5 girls sat close together on the couch, whispering and laughing softly. It was a sight Margaret hadn't seen in a long time. Usually they were spread out, distant, each trapped in her own private storm. Ethan was wiping down the coffee table when Margaret finally gathered the courage to speak. How did you do that? She asked. Ethan looked up. Do what? This, she said, gesturing toward her daughters. They haven't been this calm in, I don't even remember. Ethan paused, then sat down across from her. They don't trust people, he said gently. Not because they're bad, because they've been hurt. Margaret's throat tightened. I gave them everything, she whispered. The best schools, the best therapists, the best nannies. I thought if I removed every problem, they'd be happy. Ethan nodded. Sometimes kids don't need their problems removed. They need someone to sit with them while they feel them. Margaret looked away, blinking back tears. Their father used to do that. He was patient, warm. I'm not like him. You don't have to be, Ethan said softly. You just have to be present. That word, present, hit her like a wave. I run a company with 20,000 employees, she said. I can fix anything, except this. Ethan smiled sadly. Love doesn't respond to control. It responds to consistency. The girls watched quietly from the couch. Emily spoke up. Are you going to disappear too? Ethan turned toward her. Not today. Margaret's heart cracked open. In that moment, she realized she had been trying to lead her family the way she led her company, with systems and authority, when what they needed was connection. Outside, rain began to fall softly against the glass. Inside, something began to heal. Rain tapped softly against the wide glass windows of the Hale mansion, turning the city outside into a blur of silver and blue. Inside, the living room glowed with warm lamps and quiet voices. It felt nothing like the cold, echoing space it had been just that morning. The 5 girls sat close together, their earlier restlessness replaced by a gentle, cautious hope. Ethan gathered his cleaning supplies, slowly sliding them back into his cart. The day had been long, emotionally heavy. He could feel it in his chest, the familiar ache that came whenever he saw children who reminded him too much of his own daughter. Grace tugged at his sleeve. You're leaving now? Yeah, he said softly. Workday's over. Her face fell. Will you come back? The question hung in the air, fragile and trembling. Ethan hesitated. He thought about Maya, her small bedroom, her drawings taped to the wall, the way she waited by the door every afternoon. He needed steady work. He needed stability. I don't know, he said honestly, but I'd like to. Emily stood up, her eyes shining. Everyone says that. Margaret felt a sharp sting in her heart. She looked at Ethan, then at her daughters. 5 little souls quietly begging not to be abandoned again. Wait, Margaret said suddenly. Ethan turned. I want to make you an offer. He blinked. An offer? You've done in one day what no professional has been able to do in months, she said. Not because of training, but because you showed up with heart. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. I was just doing my job. No, Margaret said firmly. You were doing something far more important. The girls leaned forward. I want you here, Margaret continued. Not just as a cleaner, but as someone my daughters can rely on. A mentor. A steady presence. Ethan was stunned. I'm not a nanny. I'm not looking for one, she said. I'm looking for someone who stays. The word stays carried weight. Ethan swallowed. I have a daughter. She needs me. I can't be here all the time. Margaret nodded. I understand. And I respect that. We can make it work. Fair hours, fair pay, stability. The room went silent. Grace reached for his hand. Please don't go. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. This wasn't just a job. This was 5 broken hearts quietly hoping for something they were afraid to ask for. I'll come back tomorrow, he said gently. The girls gasped. Smiles bloomed. Ava actually cheered. Margaret felt tears spill down her cheeks. In that moment, a new family began to take shape. Not perfect, but real. And none of them knew just how much that choice would change their lives. The next morning, Seattle woke under a soft blanket of mist. The rain from the night before still clung to the streets, making everything look freshly washed, quiet, gentle, and new. Inside the Hale mansion, something felt different too. The air no longer carried that heavy, brittle tension. It felt hopeful and alive. Ethan arrived just after 8, pushing his familiar cart through the front doors. Before he could even say a word, 5 small figures came rushing toward him. "You came back," Grace shouted. Emily tried to hide her smile but failed. Sophie crossed her arms, pretending to be unimpressed, though her eyes shone with relief. Lily and Ava stood close behind, waiting. "I said I would," Ethan replied calmly, though his heart was warmer than he let on. Margaret watched from the stairs, her arms folded loosely across her chest. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was managing a crisis. She felt like she was standing inside something that could grow. That day didn't bring miracles. The girls still argued. Grace still cried when things didn't go her way. Sophie still used sarcasm as armor. Emily still tested boundaries. But now when things went wrong, they didn't explode into chaos. They paused. They looked at Ethan. They breathed. And he stayed. He helped Lily with her homework at the kitchen table. He listened while Ava talked nonstop about her favorite cartoons. He taught Grace how to fold napkins into little shapes. And when Sophie got frustrated and snapped, he didn't pull away. He sat beside her until the storm passed. Margaret watched it all with a tender, humbled heart. For the first time since her husband passed, she wasn't standing alone in the middle of her family. She was inside it. Later that afternoon, she joined Ethan in the living room while the girls played nearby. "I spent years thinking if I built a strong enough structure, everything would hold together," Margaret said quietly. "But I forgot that people aren't built from systems. They're built from connection." Ethan nodded. "Kids don't need perfect. They need present." The girls laughed nearby, their voices filling the house with something that felt like sunlight. Margaret smiled through tears. And so, a mansion that once echoed with loneliness began to breathe again. Not because it was filled with wealth, but because it was finally filled with love, patience, and quiet courage. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever met someone who changed everything in your life? Not by being loud or powerful, but simply by staying when it mattered most? If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more emotional stories that remind us what really makes a family.